Michael Ratney was the United States ambassador to Saudi Arabia from April 2023 to January 2025. He previously served as the Charge d'Affaires of the US Embassy in Israel and the US Special Envoy for Syria.
Ambassador Michael Ratney, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's a pleasure to have you in Majalla.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
What is the value of the American security guarantees to the Arabian Gulf and the Middle East, given the shocking strike by Israel against Qatar, which is home to the biggest military US military base in the region and which is a major US ally?
Sure. It's an important question. And I imagine it's the question that's on the mind of leaders throughout GCC countries and throughout the Middle East right now. It's quite unprecedented what happened. I think we should remember that security cooperation between the United States, the US military, and the militaries of GCC countries goes back literally for decades. And that involves defense sales and exercises and training and consultations. The level of cooperation exceeds probably the level of military cooperation between the GCC and any other country. So it's extremely important, and I think historically it represents a net advantage both for the United States and for our GCC partners, given the range of threats, whether it's Iran or their proxies, terrorists, other threats throughout the region. So that is security cooperation, and I think all of the GCC countries probably assess that security cooperation is extraordinarily valuable. When you talk about the next kind of step, going from security cooperation to formal security guarantees, that's actually something quite different. We have different sorts of relationships between the US military, between the United States, and each of our GCC partners. We don't have with any of them a formal treaty relationship. That's something that we were discussing, as you probably know, between the US and Saudi Arabia over the past 2 years in the context of discussions about normalization with Israel. That obviously doesn't seem to be very likely, at least not at this point, but it's indicative of the fact that given the range of threats that GCC countries face, principally from Iran, but others as well, they're looking for the greatest possible clarity they can get about the nature of their relationship with us. So I think the questions, I understand that they have them about the value of this cooperation, given there was an attack by an important partner of ours against an important US partner in the Gulf. But nonetheless, I don't think it's the sort of thing that would lead them to abandon the kind of deep, long-standing security cooperation that they have with the United States. If anything, I suspect they will want from us greater clarity about their expectations, the sorts of assurances that we're prepared to offer in the event that they're attacked by anyone in the future.
Before the Israeli attack on Doha, some countries in the region didn't make up their minds regarding which alliance they should opt for. Is it an alliance with the United States on the one hand, or with other countries, other heavyweight countries like China and Russia? Do you think that after this attack against, again, a major US ally in the region, that these countries will not hesitate anymore?
Well, I think all of the Gulf countries have important relationships globally. When you think about it, they're sort of at the center of the world geographically, and around them is Europe and the United States, Asia, China, India. And they have to live in that part of the world forever, and they will have important relationships, including economic relationships. I think the security partnership with the United States is different for a couple of reasons. One is that it's so long-standing. The Gulf countries and the United States military have been cooperating, training, buying defense articles of all sorts for decades. And so the level of integration between the two militaries is really unprecedented. And it's hard to simply undo that and switch to another partner. That's one reason. Another reason is, I think, the quality of US technology and US armaments is better. I mean, I suppose you could say I'm biased on that point. I certainly am, but I think it's true compared with Russian or Chinese or other sorts of armaments. I think the sorts of things that the Gulf countries could get from the United States is qualitatively better. The third reason is not a practical one, but a strategic one, and I think no less important. And that's that the United States, the reason for this significant cooperation, defense cooperation with the United States, is because the United States is one of the few countries that's willing to offer some measure of defense against the Gulf's principal adversary, which is Iran and Iran's proxies throughout the region. I could imagine countries of the Gulf trying to increase their cooperation with China, Russia. We saw recently Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But I don't think any of those countries are going to offer assurances of protection in the event Iran attacks.
Again, I mean, because the Israeli strike was really shocking and to many people in the region and many governments, and many countries were taken aback by this strike. Do you think that it was a major failure, a foreign policy failure on part of Washington, an operational failure?
That is a good question. It is, I think of that strike as part of a broader effort by Israel to kind of take the fight directly to its enemies. And obviously, Israel of late has felt unrestrained in doing that. I think at the same time, President Trump has said very clearly, actually, that he wants an end to the war. He wants an end to the war in Gaza. He expressed very public frustration with Israel about their attack in Doha. And so I don't know whether I would characterize it as a failure, but I do think it's something about which certainly the United States leadership is deeply, deeply frustrated. As you point out, it was shocking. In my experience, it was something that was quite unprecedented. And President Trump, for his part, made clear that he doesn't think this should ever happen again. He sees Qatar as an important partner, as much as he sees Israel as an important partner. And he said quite clearly, this is not in America's interest. It's not in Israel's interest. And he wants to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Is it a failure? Perhaps it's part of a broader failure to bring an end to this Gaza war.
Yeah, but in your analysis, how did Israel do it? I mean, I would say, how dare Israel strike a major U.S. ally in the region? What's your analysis?
You know, I don't have insights into the internal thinkings of Netanyahu and his leadership in Israel. And the fact of the matter is, this is quite unprecedented. So there's nothing that I can point to say this is similar to something that they had done in the past. Israel's obviously struck in Iran as of even a few months ago. Decades ago, they struck inside of Iraq. They've shown a willingness to take this fight directly to their threats if they see they have the opportunity. But to take a strike against a U.S. partner downtown in the middle of that country's capital is quite unprecedented. And it must have been a calculation on the part of the Israeli leadership that they had an opportunity and that they frankly wouldn't be constrained either by the United States or anybody else, and that the consequences, whatever they are, and we still don't know exactly what those consequences are going to be, would be worth the price. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that's my speculation.
Since you mentioned Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, my question is, do you think that A, does he have a blank check from President Trump to do whatever he wants in the region, or B, he was testing his red lines with Trump?
Yeah, good question. My sense is Netanyahu and Trump seem to have a very complicated relationship. Let's put it that way. On the one hand, President Trump wants very much to be seen as Israel's greatest champion. He said more than once that no one has done more for Israel than any other U.S. president. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that's the perception that he would like to project. At the same time, he doesn't always agree with everything Netanyahu does and says, and sometimes he very publicly expresses frustration with it, including a quote using a very bad word that I saw attributed to him today about Netanyahu. So I think it's, in a way, he has He has a very complicated relationship. He wants to be supportive. He doesn't want to be criticized for somehow constraining Israel, but he also can be quite frustrated with some of the things that Netanyahu is doing. I would say this, although, he's been publicly critical at times, he's at other times tried to distance himself. The fact is, he's never done anything in practical terms to restrain Israel's actions.
So, do I understand from your answer that Netanyahu, not himself, but the extremist-led government under Netanyahu, and he is the boss out there, has become a national security threat to the region?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I suspect that there is a perception increasingly in the Arab world, even in Gulf countries, that the nature of Israel's actions has changed from being a potentially useful, practical partner to being a somewhat unpredictable actor, perhaps a dangerous actor in the region. I don't know, a national security threat. Certainly, if you're the Qataris right now, you may feel that way. If you're another GCC country, you may be nervous that if they're prepared to strike at Qatar, what else are they prepared to do? But at the same time, I do think the Israelis understand the gravity of what they did. I don't have insights into their internal thinking, but there are some rumors that I've read that they understand that they may be overreached in this case, and that they threatened not only something that's very valuable to them, which is greater relationships with Arab countries, but also something that's of importance to their public, which is, and important to the United States as well, which is an end to the war and a release of the hostages, something the Qataris have been heavily involved in. So I think your question is a complicated one, and I don't think at this point we really have a clear answer to it.
Netanyahu and his government have become so unrestrained over the past 2 years, whether in Gaza, whether in his attacks or his wars with multiple parties in the region. What is the best way then to deal with Netanyahu, given the image dilemma of Israel nowadays, not just in the Arab world, but internationally speaking as well, due to its actions in Gaza?
I think the principal reaction right now among Israel's traditional partners, that includes the United States, European countries, and others, the real reaction right now is one of extraordinary frustration. And I think we see that frustration in some of the comments that President Trump has made. We see a lot of that frustration in the actions we saw today that Canada and Australia and the UK have pledged to recognize Palestinian statehood. I think those steps might not have great practical value, but they are a real gesture of the extraordinary frustration with Netanyahu. And that means the inability to affect his and his government's actions, particularly over the last 2 years. Whether that has an impact on Netanyahu's calculations, I don't know. The fact is, Netanyahu's calculations seem to be driven mostly by his domestic political calculations, his need to keep his government intact, his sense that he has a moment of historic opportunity with respect to Hamas. And he does seemingly feel unrestrained at this point. And I think what we'll see is countries, European countries, traditional partners and allies of Israel, increasingly frustrated and increasingly looking for ways to influence Israeli government behavior. Whether it'll have an effect, I don't know. The record of the last 2 years has been limited.
Yeah, my last question to you, Ambassador Michael Ratney, about the nature of the defense promises. I would call it as defense promises. They are not up to the level of treaties or solid agreements, like, for instance, as we witnessed a few days ago before conducting this interview between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, a solid defense agreement. What's your reading of Mr. Trump's promises about defense alliance and defense agreements? We haven't seen a timeline yet from his latest visit to the Gulf. I mean, Do you think that he would translate his promises into actions or to just talk?
You know, he's an interesting figure in that sense, because on the one hand, he went to the Gulf, to Saudi and the Emirates and to Qatar, and he pledged cooperation and trade and investment. He was very explicit, actually, when he was in Doha about his pledge to protect the Qataris because they're such an important partner. On the other hand, kind of politically, he's not somebody that has been a big fan, shall we say, of alliances. He's been critical of NATO. He's been critical of other alliances that the United States has gone into, because he has this sense that we, the United States, bear the burden for that, and other countries don't bear their responsibility. And also, I think politically in the United States, he senses the US is at a period where the idea of increased alliances, increased kind of responsibility for other countries, politically is not a popular thing. So I think there's two kind of motivations pulling at him. The sense that countries of the Gulf, whether it's Saudi, or the Emirates, or Qatar, are important partners and represent huge opportunities for the United States and for the region economically and in terms of security. But on the other hand, there's a reluctance on the part of Trump to extend US responsibility even further for other countries. I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, which I know most recently, I think if there was an opportunity to do a big deal that we had been discussing really for the past few years that involved normal relations with Israel in exchange for greater cooperation and a mutual defense treaty, I think that would be very appealing for him. But given where we are in the Gaza war right now, and given where we are in Israeli politics, that seems remote. I do think that all of those countries will seek from us I don't think they're going to walk away from security cooperation with us. I think if anything, many of them, and the Qataris have said this publicly, they'd like to see stronger security assurances from the United States. If I were Saudi or the Emirates or Qatar or any country in the Gulf, and I was kind of looking at the threats surrounding me in the region, and they're considerable, particularly Iran, I would want the greatest possible clarity I could get from the United States. And I think that's what they will try to do. And that will be an ongoing discussion. I'm sure it'll be a discussion in New York during the UN General Assembly. I know some of our senior officials will be meeting with senior officials from Gulf countries, and I'm sure they'll express their frustration. They'll express their grave concerns about what happened. But I think they'll also be interested in how can they extract more clarity about the relationship, the nature of the relationship between the US and those partners.
Ambassador Michael Ratney, the former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks for the invitation today, Ahmed.